click start, attendees can join. Yep, cool.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for our virtual panel, Suffs, From History Page to Broadway Stage. My name is Caitlyn Jones, and I am a National Park Service Mellon Humanities Fellow. I'll be your moderator tonight, and I'm joined by a brilliant panel of historians and artists, and we're going to talk about the real-life stories behind the Tony Award-winning Broadway musical, Suffs. For anyone on the call who may be unfamiliar, Suffs tells the story of the fight for women's suffrage in the early 1900s. It's a story of triumph with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, but it's also the story of struggle. Struggle against society, struggles against people in power, and struggles with each other. The complex stories told on the stage reflect an evolving and ongoing conversation among historians about how we interpret women's suffrage to the public and whose voice is left out. We'll talk about all of that and more over the next hour and a half, but first I would like to introduce some people who helped make this panel possible. First, I'd like to introduce Molly Gonzalez from the Alice Paul Center for Gender Justice. Molly is the advocacy manager. So Molly, can you tell us a little bit more about the Alice Paul Center?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm so happy to be here. I'm Molly. I'm the advocacy manager at the Alice Paul Center for Gender Justice. And the mission of the Alice Paul Center for Gender Justice is to build contemporary action and intergenerational movement for gender justice through the lens of history and place. We empower and educate young girls and women to view themselves as leaders, encourage civic engagement, preserve the childhood home of Alice Paul, and advocate for the publication of the Equal Rights Amendment, which, when enshrined in the Constitution, will give legal and lasting equal protections to people of all genders. In celebration of Women's History Month, our board of directors has pledged to match all gifts received through April 15th, doubling their impact. So every donation to APC will be matched up to $15,000. We are deeply grateful for any contributions of all sizes. Your support is essential in helping us continue offering programs like these. Thank you so much for having us. I'm so excited for this webinar.
Thank you, Molly. That's great. I'm so excited. I'm so happy that Alice Paul Center has been a partner. You've been wonderful to work with. And next up, we have Susan Philpott. She is a supervisory park ranger with the National Park Service, and she helps run the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument in Washington, D.C. Susan, can you tell us a little more about Belmont-Paul?
Sure. Thank you, Caitlin. And thank you so much, Molly. We're so grateful to the Alice Paul Center for hosting this webinar. Yes, I'm a park ranger at, it's a mouthful, the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument, which is a 200-year-old house on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. We sit actually right in the elbow of the Hart Senate Office building. So we have senators looking right out over our site. It's been a National Park Service site since 2016. And the reason we are here, and the reason it's such a prominent spot, is because for more than 90 years, it was the headquarters of the National Woman's Party, the organization of troublemakers founded by Alice Paul. And it's now a museum telling the stories of the fight for women's right to vote and the struggle for social, political, and economic equality. For Women's History Month, we're open 5 days a week. So we're open Wednesday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And we have lots of programs planned throughout the month. So if you're in Washington, D.C., please come by.
Yes, please come see us. We would love to have you. So now I'd like to introduce our panel that we have with us tonight. First up is Michelle Duster. Michelle is an author, public historian, and educator who's worked for over 30 years to highlight positive contributions of African Americans and women, including her paternal great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells. She is a columnist and cultural education editor for Rebellious Magazine and has written articles for Ms. Magazine, Time, Essence, HuffPost, Teen Vogue, People, Glamour, Daily Beast, and the North Star. She has also edited and contributed to over 20 books, plus worked on monuments, markers, murals, statues, street names, documentary films, neighborhood festivals, and film festivals. Michelle does it all, and we're so happy to have you with us tonight. Next up, we have the woman who played Ida B. Wells on stage in Suffs, Nikki M. James. Nikki was nominated for a Tony Award for her performance in Suffs, which was so powerful. She originated the role of Nabulungi in the Book of Mormon, for which she won the Tony for Best Featured Actress in a Musical. Her theater credits include Tony Kushner's A Bright Room Called Day, Broadway productions of Les Miserables, All Shook Up, and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Bubbly Black Girl Sheds Her Chameleon Skin, Romeo and Juliet, Caesar and Cleopatra, The Wiz, Julius Caesar, Twelfth Night, Bernarda Alba, and Preludes. Her recent work in television includes Apple TV's Severance, great show, and starring roles in Proven Innocent for Fox and CBS's Brain Dead. She can be seen in the upcoming Disney Plus show Daredevil. And as a director, Nikki has helmed episodes of The Bite and The Good Fight. She resides in New York City with her family and holds a BFA in drama from NYU. She is a proud voter and a sustaining member of her local public radio station, as we all should be. Thank you so much for being with us here, Nikki. Next up, we have Cathleen Cahill. Cathleen is the Walter L. Ferry and Helen P. Ferry Professor in Middle American History at Pennsylvania State University. She's the author of Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement, and that came out in 2020 with the University of North Carolina Press. Her first book, Federal Fathers and Mothers, A Social History of the United States Indian Service, won the Labriola Center for American Indian National Book Award and was a finalist for the David J. Weber and Bill Clements Book Prize. She is currently co-authoring a graphic history of the life of New York suffragist Dr. Mabel Ping Hua Lee. Her work has also been excerpted in Miss Magazine, Time, and the New York Times. She's an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer and the Vice President, President-elect of the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Thank you so much, Cathleen, for being with us here tonight. And last but certainly not least, we have Rachel Sussman. Rachel is a Tony Award-winning creative producer, educator, and entrepreneur. Her Broadway producing credits include Suffs, Tony Award-winning shows Just for Us and Parade, Pulitzer Prize finalist What the Constitution Means to Me, and Prima Facie. She is a co-founder of Soto Productions and the Mitten Lab, which is an emerging artist residency program in her native state of Michigan that focuses on nurturing the next generation of theater artists. She is also a co-founder of The Business of Broadway, an educational venture with the aim of developing more transparency between artists and producers. She has been a guest lecturer and educator at UPenn, the New School, Fordham University, University of Michigan, Juilliard, and the University of Southern California. Whew, that's all over the map, my goodness. She serves as an adjunct professor at Columbia University's School of the Arts, New York University's Tisch School of the Arts, and Berkeley NYC. Thank you so much, Rachel, for being here with us tonight. And just a reminder for the audience, near the end of the program, we are going to have a Q&A session. So there is a Q&A function in the Zoom if you want to pop a question for any of our panelists in there as they're speaking, feel free to, and also give a reminder once we've talked for a little bit here. So my first question is for everyone in the room. How did you all get introduced to the history of women's suffrage? And Rachel, since you were the last introduction, I'll start with you. And I believe in one interview, you called yourself a suffrage nerd as a kid. So tell me more about that.
I absolutely would consider myself a suffrage nerd. I first became really enamored with American women's suffrage when I was in middle school, and I had the opportunity to do a U.S. history project on any topic at the turn of the 20th century, and I picked suffrage. There were about 2 paragraphs in our textbook in our public school growing up in Metro Detroit. And I remember reading it, and, you know, it covered some of the basics that I think we all generally learn about: Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, maybe the slightest amount of Sojourner Truth, and that was about it. And I thought there has to be more to it than that. And I ended up going to the library and learning about all of these other women. And I remember having this really complicated reaction because I felt like, why is this being kept from me? Why don't we, as young people, get to learn also about the women of our history and not just the men? And that really began what has become a lifelong passion. And obsession, and what ultimately led me to sharing Jailed for Freedom, the firsthand account by Doris Stevens, secretary of the National Women's Party, with Shana Taub, the author of Suffs, over 10 years ago now, which is when we first began our foray into making Suffs a musical.
That's reminds us all of such a long process that it is to do things like that. It's you know, it's a long, arduous but fulfilling endeavor, I think. Michelle, I'm sure you had, you know, quite a different experience coming into the history of suffrage, since it's such a part of your family story.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had an exact time frame or date or something that I could, you know, sort of point to. But I think I, for me, I just remember knowing that my great grandmother was involved in the suffrage movement, but I would not necessarily call myself a suffrage nerd, because I didn't like try to delve into the information until more recently, actually. I think the more that I learned about how, I think it was just like when I was started to do more research on how the more modern feminist movement, the 1970s feminist movement, had some parallels to the suffrage movement as far as racial dynamics. I think that's when I started, and that would be honestly within the last 5 to 7 years, you know, when it started to get closer to the centennial of the 19th Amendment. I was starting to get more curious about how many similarities there were in that way. So yeah, that's what I would say is like when I started, you know, sort of delving more into it and learning more of the dynamics. Because like most people, you know, I learned about Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It was like 5 women, and then my great grandmother, you know, and so, but yeah, that's the short answer of when and how I became more interested in learning more, and why, and the sort of angle that I was taking to learn more.
What about you, Kathleen?
So, it's a great question, and I was sort of thinking about it as people were talking, and honestly, I don't remember learning anything about suffrage in middle school, elementary school or middle school, but what I do remember, and I think it's really relevant for this conversation, is Mary Poppins, right? And the Sister Suffragette song that is sung there, which is meant, of course, to be critical, and the kind of the woman who's abandoning her children to be political. But boy, that stuck in my head. I could probably sing it for you now, which I will not, but that, even in its criticalness, right, relayed some of the ideas about what suffragists wanted. And of course, they're British suffragists. So in terms of my scholarship, I've been a women's historian for a long time, and in part that's my mom, as sort of one of the second wave feminists from the 70s, made it very clear, right, that women have always had to fight for their rights. But I didn't become a scholar of suffrage until probably around 2011. It was the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, and there was all kinds of blogs, and like the New York Times was running a blog on the Civil War, and books and just talks, and so much Civil War history. And I thought, the 100th anniversary of suffrage is coming up here, of the 19th Amendment. And I wonder if there'll be that much conversation for that. And I would like there to be, and I'd like to be a part of it. So I started thinking about it a few years before that, somewhat like Michelle, and was teaching at the University of New Mexico at the time, and thought if there are going to be stories, it's going to be those 5 suffragists that we all know about. They're all from the East Coast. Most of them are white. And I wanted to bring forth some stories that students that I was teaching at UNM might recognize, right? What was happening in communities, in their communities, that could, right, speak to that story. So that's how I got started with the research, and it went from there.
That's funny that you mentioned Mary Poppins, because I had to go back and watch that recently, and I was like, was she the bad guy in this? As I couldn't remember. I was like, that's weird. That's not how I remember it. What about you, Nikki? How did you get into suffrage history?
Oh, Shayna Taub is my gateway drug to many things, because I love collaborating with her so much. And like so many of the panelists here, I'm of a certain generation where American history, although it seems like we studied it forever, you realize how limited the scope is in hindsight. And it feels like there were many holes, and probably it's purposeful, and some of it is maybe just sort of innocent oversight. But when Shayna, and I knew who Ida Wells was in bold, I could tell you what you could read on the back of a trading card or something, like sort of these like sort of bold ideas. And when Shayna said that she was writing a musical about suffrage, this was back for me in 2016, and that she was curious if I would come and sing a few of these songs just so she could hear it out loud. And I sang Wait My Turn for the first time, and I went on my mini deep dive. And as an actor, I will say that we become very mini expert historians on the people we play and the time periods we're portraying, at least those of us actors who are curious about those things. And it really can deepen the work and really free you up as an artist. So I'm so lucky in the course of my career that I've been able to meet and spend time with people like Ida and Cleopatra and fictional characters like Eponine and Abalungi. And through their eyes, I get to see, snippets of the world in what feels like a very intimate way. So that's how I dove into the American suffrage movement, and also what was happening with the civil rights movement for Black women also at the same time, which is another part of that we're not talking about today. But, the civil rights leaders, a lot of the bold named civil rights leaders in our nation all get to be Black men. And so I feel like Ida is, such an amazing individual and in more than one category here. And I don't want to give her short change there, but that's how I became, a mini historian of my small corner of women's suffrage. Yeah.
I think that's one thing that brings us all here together is we're telling the story in very different ways, but there's a lot of overlap in what we do with our goals and our ways of doing it. Now, I'm sure there are several people on this call, and I'm speaking of me, mostly of me, who aren't quite sure how Broadway works. So I was wondering, Rachel, if you could give us a little bit of background about how Suffs got to Broadway. What was that like? What was the pitch like to people? What was the reaction? And then, if you could, Nikki, kind of what drew you to the part. I know you talked a little bit about, you singing for Shayna, but I mean, there's a magnetism that you bring on stage, and I imagine that you found that somewhere.
Well, how much time do we have? No, I will share. As Nikki well knows, I also teach about how the business of Broadway operates, because it is sort of very nebulous and historically withheld often from those who are even participating on the creative side. And, Suffs initially began as two upstart young women, Shayna writing and me sort of trying to figure out as a very young producer how I could sort of find a partner who would join me in this crazy endeavor. And I remember having a meeting with Jill Furman, Tony Award-winning producer, one of the producers of Hamilton. And I sat there with her and we let Shayna do, there's no other really way to describe it except like Shayna can, she's so effusive when she is talking passionately about something that she believes in wholeheartedly, and can sort of draw anyone in. And we had one of those meetings and Jill immediately said, well, I have to do this. And, agreed to be my partner, which I was so grateful for because I had very few credits to my name at that time. And, over many years, we went through sort of a writing process where Shayna initially wrote a bunch of songs because that was her way in as a composer lyricist. And initially, Suffs was a little bit more sung through as a show in its first production. So she found her way to the characters by writing these songs. We had our first sort of sing through that Nikki was a part of, and a few of our other original Broadway company members who've stayed with the show over many years. And then we started to do sort of a reading focused on Act One. And so it went chronologically. And the Public Theater, which is one of the premier nonprofit theaters, agreed to help us develop the show. So Jill and I, as commercial partners, were able to partner with them. And they provided us with a number of resources to make that possible. We did a few readings of Act One. And then I remember when Shayna said, and now I'm going to finally focus on Act Two. And then we put both Acts One and Two together. And from there, went through a process of determining, how ready is the show at this point? What is working, what isn't working now that we have two different acts and we're trying to create a holistic story. And I will never forget that we had, and I'm sure Nikki will remember this too, at the end of 2019, we had learned that the Public Theater was going to be programming our show for its premiere production. We were so thrilled. And the show was going to be slated for around the centennial. I can see it's like gives me hives to even think about it. Around the centennial, so August, September 2020. Initially, we would have done our production. Obviously, the world had a number of other plans, so we ended up doing a reading process in the middle of the pandemic over Zoom, which is a deeply unconducive platform for collaboration, for singing. And we did learn quite a bit from that, and then went into a workshop as soon as the world opened back up, as soon as it was safe in the theater business to gather together again under a number of restrictions. We did another sort of workshop where we brought in some movement, and then we sort of slated our production for the spring of 2022. So about 2 years later than it would have gone. And frankly, I think, hindsight being what it is, that time became so instrumental to our process to really understand, whose story are we telling? How do we want to uplift all of these other women, in particular, the Suffs of color, alongside, Alice Paul and Carrie Catt. And that became sort of an ongoing question for Shayna as the author. And then we did our original production at the Public Theater, which was an incredible learning curve for us. I think it was a very challenging time in terms of how we were all existing still with COVID in our daily lives. And the show received a lot of really constructive feedback that often, I think, at that point in a show's life, to not necessarily get all of the sort of positive accolades it needs to build momentum forward, sometimes producers might like throw in the towel and say, well, we gave it, you know, the old college try and we have to move on. And I think for this team of people, which was led not only by an all-female trans non-binary cast, but a leadership team of producers, director, music director, and of course, Shayna as the sole author, we all just doubled down instead. We said, no, we want to get it right. We want to do this story, the history, and the movement justice. And we went back to work. And I mean, this is probably a good moment for me to pause so Nikki can share what her experience was when we went back into our process after our first production.
You did such a good job. And
I was like, did I hit it all? And I think I did.
I broke into types too. From the artistic point, you know, you hit a lot of the calendar stuff. And then as you were saying it, I was thinking all about the emotional stuff that was really involved in it too. And you don't need to put too fine a point of it. Everyone remembers what happened in the summer of 2020, both in this country and in this world. Everyone remembers what it was like when Shayna started working on this piece before the 2016 election, the world that we thought we were going to be doing this production in. And then when we thought we were opening it in 2020, and then we opened it in 2022 instead, and we were performing, you know, off Broadway, telling the story when the Dobbs decision was leaked, and our cast went down to a rally down at City Hall, and we sang How Long, and it felt like, how are we telling this story right now? How are we portraying these women's lives right now? And it feels like Shayna could have written this yesterday about us. And then to open the show and finally get to do it on Broadway, it was a really amazing thing to work with artists who both creative and producerial, whose commitment to getting the story right was more important than getting the approval of our peers, some of whom have bad taste in the first place. I always say that Shayna and Lee, our director, and Jill and Rachel, and the actors who were involved in each part of this, we're all sculptors with a giant piece of stone, and we knew there was a David underneath there, and we didn't stop until it was present, that the work that we wanted to tell. And it's not perfect. Theater is alive, and doing this show over these years, and the way our world has changed, the landscape has changed, the political climate has changed, the conversations we're having has changed, the tenor of the conversations have changed, and then performing a live piece of theater that's history with living, breathing artists in 4 living, breathing audiences, and how each day it changed. And so the business part of the business is always going to business, but the art part of the business, the communion between the artists and the audience, with this show in particular, I have never been through a journey where I sang Wait My Turn 8 times a week for 300 performances or something like that. And I don't miss a lot of shows. Let me just say, I go on vacation and I go to weddings, and that's about it. I don't get sick and I don't call out, but I like, it's a luxury, but also to know that every single day it felt fresh and it felt relevant and it felt important. And so that's the story of Suffs. And I know that for the people who saw it and the people who listened to it, and for those of you here who don't know it, maybe you'll go and listen to our Spotify or buy the CD or the LP. You'll feel it too. This was a labor of real love, flaws and all. Yeah.
Nikki, I also hope that you'll share a little bit about your process of having a daughter in the middle of
Sure. I made my own transformation while working on this piece. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks into our rehearsal process for the public. So I performed while growing my daughter, my 2-year-old daughter. I performed the show until I was 6 months pregnant when we closed. And then by the time we came around for our last pre-Broadway workshop, I had a 5-week-old daughter who came with me every single day to rehearsal. The generational help is my mother was there every day with my daughter in another room. that Jill and Rachel were able to like rent so that I could have a safe place to both nurse my daughter and have her be near to me, so I wouldn't have to leave her every day to come and work on this show. And it was a huge transformation. It changed me as an artist. It changed me as a person. Obviously, anybody who has gone through that transformation or had been responsible for caring for a small person, it's really profound, and it deepened my relationship with this piece and with Ida, and my sense of responsibility that I make work that means something. So, yeah.
That's wonderful, and I'm glad you developed this culture of care for each other, especially when the world was so chaotic and felt so cold and just lonely. So that culture of care is really important, and I'm glad that was part of that production. I want to switch sort of gears to the history side. So Cathleen and Michelle, your work is was instrumental in building the story of Suffs. Shayna Taub, and I'm sure other creatives on it are familiar with it. They used a lot of what you had written and infused that into the show, into the characters. And I'm curious about your reaction to Suffs. If you had heard about it before, as it was a 10-year-long process, so I'm sure like you had heard, oh, hey, there's going to be this musical, and then your reaction when you finally saw it. You can go ahead, Michelle, or Cathleen, either one.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Well, I mean, I heard about the play when it was on Broadway. I didn't hear about it when it was off Broadway. And a friend of mine, she was like, oh, we have to go see this play. I live in Chicago, so it's like, oh yeah, let's just hop on a plane and, go see a play and Broadway. So that's like a several $100, undertaking. But she and I had also worked on a suffrage mural in Chicago. And we had started the process. I guess hopefully this might be interesting to people. So you might know that there's a statue of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony that was made for Central Park, and it's the first statue that depicts women in the park. And originally, I mean, they went through several iterations of designs and thoughts about the design. And there was one period of time where there was a consideration to include my great-grandmother in some way in the statue. And that was the first time actually that I had even really thought about her being depicted, or her role in the suffrage movement being recognized. Because, I mean, even if you read her autobiography, which is called Crusade of Justice, she really doesn't talk that much about the suffrage movement in the book. And so most people think of her as a journalist. Her journalism work kind of overshadows some of the other things that she also did in life. But my point is that when this statue was being considered and created for Central Park, that's what kind of sparked my creative process of like, wow, there is something, she does need to be recognized as a suffragist and not just a journalist. And then when the final decision was made to have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, the only people that were depicted on that statue, that's when I was like, what other way can we depict her? And so I thought, well, maybe a mural, because murals are not nearly as expensive as statues. Physically, they can be a lot larger. And so I just kind of started brainstorming. And ultimately, I ended up forming a small committee in Chicago in order to create a suffrage mural in Chicago for the centennial of the 19th Amendment. So we started on the process in 2019. And then when we heard about, so we got it installed in 2021, and then we ultimately ended up installing 2 other murals that are connected more to modern. We included Kamala Harris's phrase, "I'm speaking," which we thought was a universal non-political statement. Hello. But you know, some people, like we said, everything is political. Even a woman speaking is political. And so we ended up installing 2 other murals in 2023. So there was a little bit of a delay, which is another whole long story, because all of them were supposed to be installed at the same time. But when my project partner, she's the one who heard about Suffs before I did, and she was like, you know, there's this play on Broadway. Maybe we can take our suffrage mural project to New York. And so the play actually sparked the idea for us to create a mural, because we feel very strongly that, like all of us said, we didn't learn that much about the suffrage movement in school. And so that's, to me, part of the role that public history plays, because it makes history accessible in public places. And it supplements, it can supplement what is not taught in school. And so I like to use public art as an extension of education, not just art, but it's like teaching people and inspiring people. And so that's how I kind of got into, this. And I mean, we've had to do a lot of research, even on the women who were suffragists in Chicago. And then now more, research on those who were involved in New York. And we also want to move on to other cities, Boston, Portland, Kansas City. Like, we want to paint the whole country with women, because these women are not very well known by most people. And so we want to put their names and faces out here, so that the next generation of girls and boys will know who these people are, that paved the way for us to have our rights.
I love the mural project so much. I was incredibly lucky. I got to see the production at the Public Theater, the Off-Broadway show, and then I also got to see the on-Broadway version. I live in Pennsylvania, so it's a little bit easier to drive to New York, I'm a Westerner. I'm originally from California, but so it's hard sometimes to be back here, but I am close to New York. And so, it was, I think, this idea that, 2020, it's too bad that it got disrupted, but at the same time, so many amazing scholars were finishing books, right? We were rushing to that deadline. Mine came out in November of 2020. Martha Jones's amazing book, Vanguard, came out. Allison Parker's biography of Mary Church Terrell came out. So there just was this really incredible wealth of histories that were for the centennial, and I think really expanded our notions of, who was a suffragist and who was part of this. And so when I went to the public and I saw some of my work in that play and on the stage, it was just incredible, right? It really felt like, wow, right? This stuff that we write in these books and we never quite know how many people read them, somebody read it, right? And here it is in this format that I never imagined. So that was just thrilling. And it's hard because I was there with a group of other scholars, so like Lisa Tetrault and Susan Ware, and we were watching it as scholars. So on one hand, we were amazed that this story was here, and then on the other hand, we were like nitpicking, right? Because you can always nitpick. And that was a couple years ago. And then when I saw it in September on Broadway, I really tried to keep my kind of critical lens off and just enjoy the fact that like there was a line all the way around the block to get in for a musical about women's suffrage, right? And when I was in the theater and it was sold out, that I was seeing, you know, people, this whole full house learning who Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell and Alice Paul were, right? That, and had to kind of sit with, you know, most people don't know these stories. Like I know them very well. And a lot of the people that I talk with know them very well, but to kind of step back and say, most people don't know these names. And here they are on Broadway was just stunning and really, right, I was very emotional about that. And so, and then kind of the way it builds, right, with Michelle's mural project, or, right, they were selling history books at the concession stand of the play, and seeing people, right, who are coming to the Alice Paul house, and the way that right, that this show has created some momentum around those stories. So you know, some of what I wrote about had to get cut from the public, and I can talk a little bit maybe later about how much more sympathetic I am now that I'm trying to write a graphic history and thinking about narrative and, right, how to be more dramatic in storytelling when what I want to be is like a chronicler because I'm a historian. So, you know, those are kind of the nitty gritty of how you tell a story. But I think kind of the big picture of having this on Broadway and award-winning, right? It was just spectacular.
I just want to make another comment. It's not necessarily answering your question, but I mean, I did manage to see the play twice, and was really impressed with how the suffrage movement is very complicated. It's very complex, and to try to capture it in 2 hours is really a feat. And I've heard a lot of comments from people of, well, they didn't talk about this or they didn't do this. And I'm like, it's only 2 hours. Like, you can't talk about every single last thing in 2 hours. And so considering that challenge, I felt that it was very well done. But like I said, the 2 times that I saw it, I knew the impression that I got from the people that were there. There were people dressed up in Suffs outfits, you know, they kind of making a nod to our ancestors. And it felt like sort of a girls' night out, or, you know, women's night out and women power, which is really great. But I also felt like men need to embrace this too, because we women are part of American history. We're not women, we're just women's history. And so I felt like there need, at least that was just my, you know, my emotional response. I'm like, where are the men? Men need to support women. And so in that way, it was a little frustrating that it seems like, okay, well, this play is about women, so only women can come and enjoy it and learn from it and be inspired by it. So that was just, you know, I don't know how we fix that, but I just feel like men need to step up and be there and be supportive and look at women as leaders as well.
I have something I want to just say off of what Michelle said, which is first, like, here. It was an incredibly challenging thing, you know, for us in terms of how we position the show, how we advertise the show. We had a street team that, you know, their job was to sort of be around Times Square and hand out flyers and sort of like help us to promote the show. And it was really challenging because I think we as a culture are taught male protagonism like it's water, like we know it, right? And we all know what that experience is, but we don't teach female protagonism in the same way, and you have to like opt in. And so I think for a lot of folks also, you know, it's a period piece. It's set at the turn of the 20th century. And our artwork, the production photos, everything that was out there about the show sort of showed it as a group of women in, you know, dresses with signs. And I think if you don't do any research on the show, you think, oh, that looks like not the kind of show I want to see if I'm going to go see something on Broadway. And for us, we really had to figure out, and in some ways successfully, and in some ways, I think not. And it's been a learning curve for us as we now prepare for a tour to figure out how can we also share that this obviously is a show about women. It's obviously a piece of history, but it is triumphant and joyful and entertaining and funny and an original musical in a sea of a lot of existing intellectual property. And for us, how are you able to say all of that with one image or one line, or a specific tone of voice? And all of that was such a tricky distillation, and continues to be. But I think, we were up against this all the time. Our Broadway audiences are primarily women, 40s to 60s. And thankfully, our show spoke to that demographic. That wasn't a concern, but it should speak to everyone. And that was something that we really had to fight against. And I also just want to say, off of something you said, Cathleen, I'll never forget when we did the show in a very early concert form at Harvard. Nikki, were you there when we went to Harvard? We went to the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, where Shayna had a residency. And I spoke with Susan Ware, and she said to me, another historian, she said, the way, what you're able to do in theater with dramatic license is capture so much of the emotion and capture so much of the feeling of what it was like, and not just the facts. And that is the thing that we as historians are not necessarily able to do. So we need one another, right? We don't get all of it, as Michelle said. Of course, we never could. The musical is only 2.5 hours, but our hope is that we're able to, give folks a taste so that they want to leave looking up who these women were. I've seen a number of people on the Wikipedia page for Inez at intermission, sort of out of their own curiosity. Did she really die? And yes, that all really happened. And so to me, I feel like we have done our job if folks leave interested and longing to learn more and wanting to, feel called to do something.
I think you all just sort of led into a larger question that I want to open up to just the challenges in bringing these stories to the public. Obviously, we've been talking about, a musical's 2-3 hours. You can't fit everything in there. But even, Cathleen, with your graphic novel coming up, Michelle, with your mural and monument projects, what are some of the challenges in bringing these stories, and even stories that weren't addressed in Suffs? What is that? What are challenges in bringing that to the public? How do we get them to care?
I
That's
mean,
a question.
if we could answer that question, if we could answer that question, we wouldn't have these problems.
There would be no panel today. Yes, yeah.
Sure. I think the conversations, and this is the thing about this panel that I think is really smart and exciting to me, and why I was like, yes, is that it's about different disciplines continuing to communicate with each other with respect. I love knowing that I don't have to be the historian that Cathleen and Michelle is, and I don't have to be the fundraiser and the marketer that Rachel is. And I think of our park ranger friend who is there to be the steward of the physical bodies of these places, and that all of us both working together and being in conversation with each other and highlighting each other's work. It's like what Rachel said about it becoming water. It has to start to become just second nature that these things are in conversation with each other the way they are in a more mainstream way. And I go back to I went to an all-girls Catholic high school only for 2 years because it was not for me. But I remember a freshman year in English class, I'm a thespian, I'm an artist. I love narrative story. And every single book we read that was canon had a male protagonist. And I asked my teacher and I said, are we going to read any stories about girls? We're all girls. or by women. I think, and we read that year, we read a separate piece. I'll never forget this. I will give this list till the day I die. Separate piece, Catcher in the Rye, Great Expectations, Lord of the Flies. We did read To Kill a Mockingbird, so there's Scout, right? And then he said sophomore year, and then the first book we read sophomore year was The Scarlet Letter. And I thought, well, and I thought even then, as a young person, I was like, there's more out here. So when the canon and the conversation, when we can say these names, when I can say Suffs or Alice Paul, and the person I'm talking to can download even their limited history, that's the work that we're doing with the mural, and then a well-edited wiki page, and then a great musical, and then a phenomenally researched book, all of these things to be like different facets. I think that's how we start to change the conversation. And yeah, and each of us, staying dedicated in our lane and then being in communion and communication with each other. Does that seem right?
Yeah. Oh, and I would just add, right, one thing that was so amazing about the centennial is that happened and kind of in real time in a way that usually it happens over a much longer period. Someone writes a book, someone reads it, and then maybe, right, then does the musical. But this all happened kind of clustered around 2020, and to be part of that and to see it, the synergy was really amazing. Yeah.
One of the other things I found really profound about the centennial was the choice that, prior to that, I think that it had been, a lot more of the white suffragists had been taking up space in the narrative. And I feel like 2020 was a moment where there was a shift, not only in terms of obviously the work of the academics and historians who had all of this knowledge, but the public became so hungry for it. They said, we also want to know about Mabel Pingwali and Mary Church Terrell and Zikala Sa and all of these other women who have been pushed to the margins, because we know as today in the 2020s that of course it was not done by only one group of people, and in fact it actually helps us to remind ourselves that this fight continues and we all need one another in it.
One of the things that I appreciated about the play was how I thought it was honest about the fact that I mean, I think everybody who's involved in a movement has the same goal, but you have different strategies, you have different priorities, you have different personalities, you have, power struggles, and you also have personal prejudices and, sensibilities of your sort of the natural order of the world. And that's another thing that, like I said at the beginning, as far as, I've done as much research as I can, because I'm not a specialist in one particular thing. But there are parallels between the suffrage movement and this women's movement of the 1970s as far as this fragmentation. There is not this like we're all women and we're all in this together and we're all fighting for the same rights for everybody at the same time. There are hierarchies, and some of it is racial hierarchy. And I thought that the play captured that in an effective way, because it's real, it's real, and it hasn't changed as much as we would hope. I mean, even today in 2025, we are talking about the last election and how people voted. You look at the results of by race, how people voted, and there's a divide, and so even now we're not all on the same page. Not all women are on the same page. Not all women have the same priorities. And so I think when people look at the Suffs play, they can see they can see things that they can relate to today. And I think that's what makes it relatable. It makes it contemporary in a way, you know what I mean?
It's I want to say thank you for saying that, Michelle, but also I feel I didn't write it and I totally agree with you. And it was a very hard balance that we dramaturgically Shayna was struggling with, which is how can you be honest? You know, these were not perfect warrior women. They were flawed, they were human beings, and they made often politically expedient choices over justice-based ones again and again. And to not show that would have actually been a lie. And that scene that happens early in the musical with Ida B. Wells, Nikki portraying Ida B. Wells and singing Wait My Turn was really important to Shayna, but also to sort of the ethos of the show that we were creating, which was to tell the truth of this movement in all of its flaws and all of its complexity.
I want to add to all of this to say that as like the artistic part of it, this as the artist person is that working on this piece means that we as artists collectively had to have very difficult conversations because you have to talk about how you're going to portray these very complicated ideas. And we were obviously working on it in a complicated political climate, and there continue to be, and also there were all kinds of feelings coming up about our health too with COVID. And so we had to really forge a path working on a piece like this where we had very difficult conversations with as much respect as we could in a time where even just saying something that felt true could be like pretty scary. And I feel like I learned so much about collaboration and coalition building about myself and my community by working on a piece about people who are having trouble with coalition building and collaboration. Talking to, I'm an actress in my 40s. I've been in this business for 20 years, talking to a young 20-year-old Black actress coming out of school, and the different ways in which we think about the business, think about ourselves, think about our bodies, what we're willing to accept. And I've had many, like Carrie Cat, Alice Paul conversation where I think like these young women don't know anything, they don't know. And I'm not even like halfway through my life, I hope, so this show, working on it together, building it the way Shayna built this room and Lee and Rachel was actually a really amazing, interesting parallel to a lot of the conversations that we were having that we're talking about on stage. And I think because we were having those conversations complicatedly, it allowed the work to also be as nuanced and complicated, both from what was actually written and just what happens with the performers on stage. So it was really the parallels of working this kind of work and then performing it were not lost on me. And it was a really amazing, unique experience.
Thank you all for such a wonderful, free-flowing conversation that was really, really wonderful to hear. We've got so many questions in the chats, but also so many shout outs. So many people have seen it. So many people are excited for this work. And there's like so many stories of like, oh, I went and saw Suffs and, sat next to this sweet old man at Suffs. So there are men there. Hopefully we need to get more there. Yes, but there are some. One question that may or may not be able to answer is about the touring production of Suffs. It's for Nikki. Will you be on tour or any of the other original cast potentially on tour?
Rachel, I can say I will not be joining the tour. I don't know who will be. I'm sure the cast will be amazing. My time with Suss was incredible, and it's obvious it's going to be, in my past. I've already moved on to other projects, and I'm home based in New York with a young kid. Like touring is not a possibility, but I would be so excited to take this story outside of New York, and I am so thrilled that it will go on the road, and I can't wait to see it and support it and be there. But it won't be me.
Stay tuned for who the cast will be.
Yay, news to come. And this is potentially a question for everybody in the room. What other movements would you like to see turned into a musical? Like there's a lot of good choices here.
I mean, I'll go first, which is there are some there are some really exciting shows that I know have been in the works, whether or not they've actually made it to Broadway, about workers' rights and union movements, sort of focused on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. There's a really amazing play, one of my favorite plays, The Normal Heart by Larry Kramer, which is a play about the AIDS crisis and the fight there through the lens of some real individuals. And I personally feel very excited about whatever is to come in terms of work about the climate movement.
I I actually would think it would be interesting to see the Pullman Porters story, because that's another story that is very undertold. And A. Philip Randolph was a force that most people have never heard of. And so I don't know. I just think that would be interesting. I mean, they were mostly men who were Pullman porters, but still, it's such a labor. It's the same, along the lines of what you said, Rachel. It's a story about labor, and a lot of people probably don't know that A. Philip Randolph was one of the architects of the March on Washington, and so his story is very interesting. And another thing that just came to mind, because I've never been asked this question before, so I've just been like, off the top of my head, I really think it would be interesting to see a play about the Black Panthers, because I think that they are framed in a way that's not fair to what they were really about. I think their focus is lost in sort of the rhetoric. And if people knew what their actual initial mission was and some of the activities that they were involved in, they were sort of the precursor to some of the things that we benefit from today. So I just think if their story could be told in a fair and balanced way, they would be viewed in a different way than a lot of people think of them when they first hear the name Black Panthers. So those are the two things that come to my mind.
Michelle, maybe after the mural happens in New York, you're going to be commissioning some artists to make those musicals.
Yeah, I need a trust fund. I need a what do you call it?
You don't need it. I'm here. I'm a living proof that you do not, but it is a hard thing to
Well,
be.
we need funding.
Yeah, definitely.
You need an Alva Belmont, right? You need the patron.
Yeah. An endowment.
Right. There's a question here for Cathleen about Southwestern women who contributed the fight to the fight for suffrage. If you could, if there are any that we should know about, we're talking about how we're not able to fit it all in a 3-hour musical, but maybe we can learn more about people working in the Southwest.
Absolutely. So, I mean, something that somebody mentioned earlier, and I think is important, is that, for a lot of the women, I mean, suffrage is a huge grassroots movement. There are so many stories, right? There are so many stories. But for many of the women that I wrote about, or yeah, it was Michelle was saying, Ida B. Wells doesn't talk about suffrage a lot in her autobiography, and it's in part because suffrage was just one of many activities, one of many things that they were involved in. And the vote was a tool, right, to get to other ends. So in the Southwest, you see Mexican-American women. I wrote about Nina Otero Warren in New Mexico, who is, in fact, the New Mexican chair of the National Women's Party, the state chair in New Mexico. And she's what we might call Latina. At the time, she would have referred to herself as an Hispana, right, a woman of Hispanic descent. But right, for her, the vote was important because in New Mexico, she was interested in protecting the Spanish language, protecting religious freedom, where Catholics were, felt under attack, and protecting kind of her heritage from colonialism, right, from the incoming cultural colonialism. And so for her, the vote, women's suffrage was a way to work with Hispanic men to kind of, for those ends. In Texas, Jovita Aydar, who has an incredible story, it would be amazing to learn more about, but she's a journalist like Ida B. Wells. She's someone who wrote about the Mexican-American community in Texas and what they were, the prejudice they were facing. They're also facing lynching in Texas. She had her press destroyed at one point because people didn't like what she was saying. So there are, lots of women who are advocating for the vote or who are very politically active, but maybe were more involved in kind of other, put their energy into other places, but saw the vote as really a powerful way to address those concerns. And so that's something, when you look at the National Women's Party papers, you might not see them as clearly. You might see one or two letters from Nina Otero Warren, but you really have to go to New Mexico, or you have to go to the papers of the NAACP or the Crisis or the National Association of Colored Women, or you have to go to the Chinese Student Alliance papers to find them more of their story. And so, so there are absolutely women in the Southwest. And again, the National Women's Party, at least for New Mexico, recognized that they had to work with Spanish-speaking women if they had a chance of getting that state to ratify the 19th Amendment, which it did. It was the 32nd state to ratify.
Kathleen,
can I just add one?
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
No, I wanted to kind of piggyback off of what Kathleen said, as far as Black women specifically, and it sounds like Latino women were similar. A huge difference between them and some of the white women leaders was that the voting, the access to the ballot was considered to be a tool in order to make an impact on other parts of their lives. And so that's why, I mean, I've met a lot of historians who say that's why it has been more challenging to find information about some of the Black women who were involved in the suffrage movement, because it was embedded in so many of the other activities that they were involved in. So it wasn't like my great grandmother had the Alpha Suffrage Club, which, was for suffrage, but she was also part of the National Association of Colored Women. And she was one of the founders of the NAACP, and just all, she was like everywhere. But it was like within those clubs, there was part of their mission was to access the vote. It wasn't the one and only thing that they were working for. And so that made it kind of different approach and different strategy than some of the white women who were like their one and only focus was kind of about, they were laser beam focused on accessing the vote, and it wasn't like a holistic kind of thing. And that's a big difference. And I think it speaks to just the reality of women of color in general, that there's so many things that you're fighting for. And a lot of the women were fighting for almost everything at the same time. So it just became sort of one thing on the agenda. And that makes the experience and the history a little different.
That's absolutely true. And I think too, expanding the story, not just along racial lines, but along regional lines, like really brings a lot of nuance to the story. And one question that we have, it kind of explores a lot the nuances in Suffs as well. Someone wants to know, can you talk more about the process and decisions, Rachel, surrounding how to address Carrie and Molly's relationship, which was a really interesting aspect of the show.
Definitely. I mean, that is one of the moments that felt really important to include because it was true. And initially in our production at the public, we included it at the end, but it felt like much more of a surprise to folks, and we wanted it to be really sort of quietly embedded throughout the storytelling that, you know, this was a pair of Suffs who not only were, you know, working together, but they were also life partners. And it felt that much more meaningful than when at the end of the show, you see Carrie and Molly reunite and Molly forgive her and then sort of sing about what they wish could be possible for them. And they are buried together. It's like a really moving thing. I truly believe and hope that there are people watching this Zoom who are so inspired by Suffs that they go off and write the Ida B. Wells musical and the Molly and Carrie Meet Cute Love musical and all of these women in many ways I think deserve their own story. And the thing that's so beautiful about Suffs is introducing them and allowing them to come alive in the national imagination as three-dimensional human beings, not just on the pages of history books. And so all of that with Carrie and Molly was true. And as a queer woman myself, I love it, and I, you know, am hungry for more of that too.
This next question is for Nikki, and we've kind of touched it a little bit in the panel, but it's about just how you find that character. Someone said, I was there for both the day after the election and the final performance, and both were electric. How do you as a performer prepare and internalize or even absorb all that's happening while you're on stage?
Big shows to be at, big shows. So emotional. You know, it's this amazing, it's this line that you're constantly threading, which is that you're, especially when you're playing a real person. I've not had a lot of experience where the research that I get to do into the character's life is not wholly in my own imagination. Of course, when you play a fictional character, it's what's in the book or what's in the play, and then the rest of the life you get to manifest for yourself and make that as full or as opaque as you need it to be to tell the story. And then you have to remember that that person doesn't just exist in your brain and your imagination or on a piece of paper, that they, for the audience, are you. And so you meet that character, and then that you're an actor who's a human, who has a real life, who has emotions and feelings about what's happening in the world and your personal life and the fact that it's raining or that the cab driver yelled at you. And then you have to marry that with the moment of telling like what's happening in this play. And the thing that I give myself grace with as a performer is to decide that it never has to be the same, that I have to tell the story that's on this page and get from the beginning to the end, but I'm allowed to feel differently about it every single time I do it. And that's how it stays alive. And then because I have that, given myself that permission, I don't have expectations about how it's going to feel. And so I get to experience it, and then very healthfully. And the best part about the stage, in one of Rachel's shows, Heidi pronounce her last name for me.
Track.
Shrek, talks about this word, the penumbra, which she describes in the show as like the difference between like light and dark and the space in between. And I heard that in this play, and I think that's what actors do. We stand in the dark and then we cross into the light, and somehow through that transition period, that's like, it's not a film, it's not like a line, it's sort of this nebulous, you leave yourself and you meet this person, and then you get to do the reverse. And so I've had a lot of practice of doing emotional roles, and I've developed for myself a very a system that's not, a regimen, but it's the way I do it. And I will say that it's also very amazing, the catharsis of sharing something with an audience, and then the applause that you get at the end has a really nice way of like capping a performance and allowing you to leave it behind. This show, certain performances of this show, more than any show I will have ever done, I think are now core memories in my life. The day after the election is one. The day that Kamala was announced to be the nominee is one, and our closing performance is another. And I think that it was the perfect marriage of my art and my world and my everything that I wanted this when I went into the world of theater making and storytelling, what I wanted it to be, which is like alive. So it's very lucky, and and then you have a therapist. How's that? that's then you go to therapy and drink wine.
You know what, can I just want to say something really quickly about Nikki. I found it very interesting that you had a child and you were nursing your child while you were preparing for the play. And to me, that almost, it like gave you an extra level of sort of connection with Ida, because when she went to the founding of the National Association of Colored Women, she was nursing a child. And when I heard that was, that happened with you, I was like, oh my God, like, I don't know if you felt that, but when I heard about that, I was like, wow, you, in some like really weird, visceral way, maybe had like a deep, even though it's sort of a deeper connection with her as a person.
Yeah, it's true. And what I say is like I found that like my well is deeper than I knew. Shana writes the line, I have 4 children, I haven't slept in years, and that is true. While raising her family, Ida was traveling, going all over the world, and never leave, like lessening the load of her other responsibilities. And I found like working on this piece as a mother, as a New Yorker, is that my capacity to do more is just like larger than I had ever imagined. And so this, both doing the show, being a mother, and going through what we're going through, I'm realizing just like how much more expansive and how much more strength I have than I even knew. So that's been the other gift. Yeah, that's been one of the other gifts.
We have a question from a young audience member. Her name is Ellie, and she's 9 years old, and she loves Suffs. And she asks, what advice do you have for theater kids like me, passionate about women's rights, that I can use to help make a difference? And I think we're all asking that question, Ellie.
Who goes? Who goes?
You want, oh, I'm happy to start, but then I think everybody probably has something to say. Well, first of all, Ellie, we need you, especially right now. And, one of the things that I found, and I know Nikki and so many of our other company members have found, and Shana says all the time, is after the election, there were a lot of adults who came to the show feeling some sort of despair or hopelessness, and that was never true for any of the young people. They always felt inspired by the show, that they can do anything and they can change the world. And I think that is true. And I think the show is a sort of torch, passing of the torch to the next generation in a way. And there are some amazing organizations for young activists. We actually have a young activist who's become very friendly with the show, named Carolyn, who runs an organization called the Yellow Roses, who does a lot of work in particular around the ERA and work for women's rights. She's based in DC, and you can certainly, look up her organization and get involved in that way. And then I think, if a cause like I think identifying a cause that's really important to you, and maybe it is women's rights, but there's so many causes that need attention and need support. And if you were to pick up the mantle and fight for one of them, whether it is even the rights of young people, I think that would be really important and really profound. And I hope that you will be a future activist.
Thanks for watching, Ellie. We do have some questions about best books, best texts to go, places that we can go to learn more about women's history. So if anybody has any recommendations on here, I know we talked a little bit about Kathleen's book, Recasting the Vote, is really, really wonderful. Michelle's books, I to Be the Queen, and her children's books as well are wonderful. I know Suffs has an education page on your website with different books and different types of ways to learn about suffrage. So we can get more titles from the group here. And then Susan, I don't know if you have any suggestions about different places in the park system that people might be able to visit to learn more about women's history. Go ahead, Cathleen.
I want to put in I want to put in 3 plugs. 2 are for recommended readings, but kind of bouncing off the last question about what people can do. I would love it if everyone on the line could look up the SAVE Act that Congress is going to be debating very soon, which is about voting rights. And maybe check out the League of Women Voters, which was founded by Carrie Chapman Catt. And the League of Women Voters is a great place to get some of that information. So that would be awesome. I'm going to recommend Susan Ware's Why We Marched, which has about I think it's 19 for the 19th Amendment, 19 short biographies of suffragists from all over the country. So you mentioned region, Caitlyn. I think that's really true, right? The Western states fully enfranchised women at the state level before the 19th Amendment. So you learn about Utah and mountain climbers in Washington and kind of all sorts of women. And then there was a project I worked on called the National Votes for Women Trail, which put up historical markers. They were aiming to put up a marker in every state and territory in the US, and they got pretty close, but they also have a digital map, and you can find your state and see kind of some of the important places in your state. And again, it gives you a sense of how many women from so many different places were involved in this struggle. And I find that really inspiring.
And as far as visiting places, so there are many national parks around the country, national park sites that are specifically for things having to do with women's history, women's rights. National Historical Park in Seneca Falls, the site of the first Women's Rights Convention, the Clara Barton House in Washington, D.C. There are 2 sites for Harriet Tubman, who was also a suffragist, both on the Eastern Shore of Maryland and in New York. Rosie the Riveter, World War II home front is a great place. But women are half of the population. So women were involved with every historical site that you could go to and every natural site too. One of the things leading up to the centennial that the Park Service focused on was getting those stories in the parks. So parks finding those stories and telling those stories, and then also getting them online. So there is a women's history subject site for the National Park Service, and you can find anything that you want. There are so many, there are articles, there are biographies, there are videos, there are podcasts, there are all sorts of things on the website for all ages that you can find there as well. So there's a wealth of information we hope we've piqued your interest in that.
Thank you, Susan. We're going to do 2 more questions. One's kind of a quick question. We are getting a lot of questions about when the PBS special for Suffs might air, if that is information that you could share.
We don't have a final date yet, but I can share that it is planning to come out in the next calendar year.
Wonderful. So we will all be looking forward to it. And then a question that I think we can all kind of put a finer point on. What do you think the most important lesson modern audiences can take from the women's suffrage movement? Whether they saw Suffs, whether they're learning about it from a book, whether they're learning about it from a mural. What's the most important takeaway that we should bring with us as an audience that we can learn from these women?
I would just say that the idea of collective activism is really important. I get asked a lot, what can I do? And I mean, that's one of the things about the suffrage movement that is inspiring, that women worked together even though they didn't agree with each other all the time. And I also think that's an important takeaway, is that, you're going to have friction, you're going to have conflict. That's part of life. But if you can still figure out a way to stay focused on the ultimate goal, then you can change the world.
I think that that's exactly right. The thing I always say is that there can be conflict in coalition, and that has to be part of the conversation. I also think we have to put ourselves in their shoes. And, I had a not so, astute person say, well, why would I need to see it? I know what happened. And I was like, of course, we know that it was inevitable or it is inevitable to us because it exists, but for them, it was not. And it took many generations of women, and their male allies to make it happen. And so the idea that some goal is out of reach or not possible is the lie that the people in power would like you to believe so that you will give up. And so I think that being short-sighted about the thing that I want isn't going to happen tomorrow, therefore it is not worth endeavoring for it today, is the lesson I think I really take away from this musical. And then that one must keep their eye on the prize and then not let it, slip away, or assume that the work has been completed, right? Like that we've gotten to a place and that we will never fall back from there. That's what I'm learning now. But I think there's that it's a long journey here, that change requires patience sometimes.
I'll just piggyback on that and say, absolutely, right? This was something that generations of women fought for, right? Going way back to the founding, and that they recognized that they had a history and they celebrated that. And they also recognized that young people had a place in the movement too. I mean, there were tensions, as we see in the musical, but in their parades and their pageants, they often had older women and young girls, right? And sometimes young boys, recognizing that this was generational and that each generation had something, right, to teach the next. And that, right, even after the 19th Amendment, there were still women who couldn't vote, right? And so it was an ongoing fight, and it continues to be, right, a right that people have to continually fight to have. So, yeah.
And I will share some, one of the epigraphs of the show is, you are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it, which is attributed to the Talmud. And I think this idea that keep your eye on the prize, but the work will continue, right? There's always going to be more to do. And every, check it off the box and know that there will always be more to do, and the work is never over and it can't be done alone. And I'm looking at Nikki because that was a previous finale of our show. And it remains true. And I think this idea, it's the same sort of anthemic message of keep marching, right? That there's always going to be more to do, and there will always be, the next generation of young people who are going to pick up the pen or pick up the protest sign and keep going.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I feel really inspired. I'm glad to all meet you and learn about your stories. I feel so fulfilled. And so again, thank you so much. And thank you to the participants. You had some great questions in the chat. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but you were so enamored in the conversation, just like I was. And we really appreciate it. And if you are looking for more programming like that, the Alice Paul Center for Gender Justice does panels like this. So if you want to look them up on Eventbrite or go to their website, you can see more panels like this and sign up as well. And then you can find all of our lovely panelists online as well. Look out for Cathleen Cahill's graphic novel of Mabel Pinghua Lee. Look out for the touring production of Suffs, and also the PBS show, Michelle's murals project in New York, and all of her wonderful writing. You can go find her online, as well as Rebellious Magazine. And Nikki, we'll be sure to catch you in Daredevil. That's a super cool booking. So, and I'm sure we will see you in plenty more productions. But thank you, everybody, for such a wonderful conversation. And I hope you all have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you for leading us, Caitlyn.
This was
Yes,
lovely.
thank you.
Everyone.
Fantastic job, Caitlyn. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, it was no work on my end. You guys are such great conversationalists, and the questions you asked each other and how you built off of everything is wonderful.
Thanks. Good night, all.
Good night.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you so much for coming.
Bye.
Bye.